We live in a world obsessed with metrics. Stock indexes, productivity curves, all these other performance indicators. These are the numbers we chase, the ones we build entire policies and worlds around. But none of them can measure what it feels like to be alive right now. Consider, anxiety is skyrocketing. Loneliness has become epidemic. Trust in institutions, in each other, even in ourselves, is at an all-time low. We've built cities that glitter, but they don't nourish. We've scaled systems that function, but don't feel. And perhaps most revealing of all, we don't treat mental health as infrastructure. We treat it as a luxury, a private concern, something to manage if we have the time, the money, or the crisis and the urgency. But not as something foundational to society's success. And I think that's an outright category error. When I first got into neurotherapy, I wasn't thinking about philosophy or politics or any of this stuff. I just wanted to feel better. Like so many others, I was dealing with patterns in my mind that felt like they were working against me. But the deeper I studied, the more I saw and realized mental health isn't just about managing symptoms. It's actually about signal, alignment. It's about removing distortion. It's about restoring structural clarity to thought itself. And that insight led me to a philosophy called Ontological Mathematics. It's a modern, logic-based revival of Pythagorean idealism. It proposes something both radical and really rigorous, that reality is not made of matter, but of thought produced by countless minds dreaming the universe into existence. And it's not just thought, it's structured thought, mathematical thought. And the substance of these thoughts? It's frequency, motion, waveforms. This isn't metaphor or spiritual woo, it's literal mathematics. In this system, the soul is the seat of the mind, and it isn't symbolic or poetic. It's a certainty, a logical certainty, a mathematical singularity of eternal motion. Each of us is defined not by a vague spirit or magic, but by a precise interference pattern of sinusoidal waves. Our minds themselves are waveforms, and our internal experience is shaped by the phase relationships of those waves. Now, phase, simply put, refers to how two or more waveforms are timed relative to each other. When they're in sync, they amplify each other. And when they're out of sync, they interfere, producing distortions. Now, in our minds, this can translate to either clarity or confusion, to coherence or chaos. And here's the real crux of it. Our work, our growth, is about resolving that internal interference, becoming structurally clear, not perfect or even enlightened, but at least integrated and whole, a unified signal. Because if reality is structured thought, if mind truly underlies everything else, including matter, then mental clarity isn't marginal, it's central. It's the real infrastructure beneath everything else that we build. And when parts of the psyche fall out of alignment, when subcomponents of the self pull in conflicting directions, those interferences generate mental distortion, incoherent thought loops, emotional dissonance, behavioral fragmentation. And in the brain, we can even see these distortions in EEG patterns, in unstable frequency bands, misfiring circuits, and chaotic rhythms. This isn't theory. And again, this isn't spiritual new age woo. It's real measurable signal. And that's what brings us to neurotherapy. Here's the link. Every distorted mental pattern produced by a thinking mind or soul leaves a fingerprint in the brain. And those fingerprints aren't mysterious. They're patterns of maladaptive neuroplasticity, repetitive loops where certain regions of the brain have become overconnected or disconnected. often as a response to stress or trauma or some past experience. In other words, communication breaks down, not just metaphorically, but literally. Brain regions stop synchronizing, timing gets skewed. And in neuroscience, the word we use for that communication and the timing is phase. The same as we see in the mathematical mind. We're not just working with thoughts. We're working with timing, with rhythm, with structural clarity of signal, both mental and neural. And when we restore that, the psyche can begin to self-organize again. The soul itself can begin to heal. So what started as personal healing, for me, became philosophical inquiry. And what I found next was also radical, but strangely obvious. I saw that societies don't break down because they lack innovation. They break down because their constituent minds are fragmented. And eventually, without coherence, it all comes tumbling down. We can have the best technology, the most efficient systems, the most robust economy, at least on paper, and still be miserable. I mean, look around. We can still be unstable because the foundation of any human civilization is fundamentally the human mind. Now, I'd argue that even if you prefer philosophical materialism to idealism, mind as an emergent property of matter, I hope we agree on the importance of our minds. And when those minds are distorted, when internal waveforms are clashing instead of harmonizing, everything else they build will reflect that noise. We might call it burnout. We see violence, authoritarianism, distrust. But underneath all of it is really phase disorder. Distortions in the timing and structure of our individual and collective thoughts. Misaligned thought patterns, internal subwills that haven't been integrated, and what happens is they operate like rogue frequencies in the psyche. The result isn't just individual suffering, it becomes structural dysfunction all around us. Mental illness is often framed as a private problem. But when millions of people are trapped in self-defeating neuroplastic loops, distorted by trauma or stress, this is not just psychology, it's signal degradation at scale. And then here's something uncomfortable to consider. And I see this all the time. For many of us, these distortions start to feel like our identity. We confuse trauma with personality. We cling to patterns that once kept us safe, but now hold us back. But is that our true self? Or just the signal that's been distorted the longest and we've just gotten used to it? Here's where I think ontological mathematics changes the conversation. Because it doesn't just claim that the soul is real, it defines precisely what that means using logic alone. There's no room here for faith or belief. Every mind is a standing wave of thought, and psychological health is the degree to which its components resonate in structural alignment. When waves are in phase, they amplify. The self becomes unified, thought becomes clear, action becomes intentional. When waves are out of phase, they interfere destructively. The self fragments, thought loops, motivation can become hijacked. This isn't poetry. It's not metaphor. It's mathematics. It's necessary mathematics, and it's reality. And in this frame, mental health isn't about compliance or positivity. It's about reducing internal distortion. Clear thinking isn't subjective. It's structural. Just like we can detect a warped signal in a radio, we can detect distortion in a mind and in a brain. And thanks to ontological mathematics, we can now define precisely what clarity means in terms of pure waveform alignment. Now, I'd like to share a historical anecdote. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the great rationalist philosopher from the 17th and 18th centuries, who you probably haven't heard about, once imagined building a machine to resolve human disputes because he believed that given the same axioms, reason would be universal. If we all spoke the same language, clearly, we could resolve any argument. And he was right and ahead of his time. But I don't think we need machines, and I don't think we want machines to do the thinking for us. We can train our minds and our brains to think more clearly, more aligned, and more free. This same logic extends outward. Just as internal subcomponents of the self or psyche can clash, so too can and do individuals within a society. These days, we've mistaken polarization for opinion. But I think it's often just a signal conflict, interpersonal phase incoherence, not true rational differences. We find ourselves locked into bitter ideological wars, not because of rational difference, but because we're clinging to unexamined programming, fear, wounded pride, projection. It's all this irrational psychic noise that's masquerading as belief and values. But here's something profound, and I think surprisingly rational. Thought itself has a structure like we've been talking about. Now, in The Dream of Matter, my upcoming book, I talk about how thought is a language. Not like a language, it is a language. And it's a system with both a syntax and a semantics. The syntax of thought is its structure. It's mathematical sinusoidal waveforms, mathematically defined and logically precise. The semantics is the meaning that emerges from those waveforms when we experience them. The feeling, the image, the insight. So syntax is the math, and semantics is the mind's poetry. Now here's where I think it becomes almost magical, but very real and mathematical. When the syntax of our thinking begins to align with that of another, the semantics, the meaning we draw from it, begins to align between us too. It follows. Now, not in a way that erases differences, but in a way that allows us to resonate with each other more clearly. When we clean up our internal noise, when we tune our syntax, our mental waveforms, to be structurally clear, we don't lose our individuality, we become better able to share it, more able to be understood, more able to listen without reacting. And I think that's where Rousseau's vision of a general will stops being an abstraction or an idealist fantasy and becomes something real. Not a coercive force, not a top-down mandate, but an emergent coherence, a collective field of meaning that arises when enough minds have reduced their distortion. It's not uniformity, it's not groupthink, it's harmony. Imagine a jazz ensemble. Each player gets to improvise freely, but within a shared structure, a shared time signature, a shared key. That's what collective clarity can look like. Or the brain. Consider, different brain regions do different things, but when they're appropriately synchronized, they all work together beautifully. This is individuality, but aligned. Diversity, but synchronized, not silenced. That's the general will. Not a doctrine we have to agree on, but a signal, a shared signal that we begin to all hear together. And perhaps Rousseau was right to warn that sometimes man must be forced to be free, not through violence or control, but through a kind of paradox of lucidity. You see, true freedom begins when we relinquish our false attachments or these distortions we're talking about. When we stop defending the noise inside of our minds and we start aligning with the signal beneath it. I think there's something almost existential in that question again. Who are we, really? Are we just the product of experience and our trauma and our reaction to things? Or are we something deeper, something with a real structure that's aching to become more clear? Look around. And I hope when we look around, it's obvious. Nearly every social crisis we see has a root in mental disorder. We have wars driven by paranoia or greed. We have policies distorted by trauma. We have institutions held hostage by fear, ego, and unhealed pain. And really, I think if you look at any act of cruelty or injustice, you'll likely find a tangled knot of unresolved pain beneath it. We'll see fear masquerading as ideology, or maybe insecurity dressed up as leadership. So, what does all this mean for policy and for governance and how we organize the world in our societies? Well, for a start, I think it means we stop treating metrics like GDP as gospel. It means we stop mistaking outputs for outcomes. Because things like GDP rise when people are in prison, or when they're addicted, or when we're at war. And that's not progress. I mean, that's pathology. And it also means we have to stop pretending that minds are mysterious black boxes that we'll never understand. They're not. They're structured mathematically, rationally, even observably. And when we begin to understand that structure, we can support their integration. Because governance isn't about control. It's really about signal architecture. It's not top-down force, but how to find and coordinate bottom-up resonance. We shouldn't be optimizing society for efficiency. We should be optimizing for collective phase alignment, for psychological clarity, for internal unity. And that begins not with systems of power, but with systems of support. So I think we don't need stronger rulers, yet another strongman. We need stronger signal and people who can cultivate that. And here's the new frontier. We can now see the signal. We can measure it. We can quantify it. Neurotherapy and EEG analysis allow us to map patterns in the brain that mirror distortions in the mind. What ontological mathematics defines in terms of wave interference, neuroscience is beginning to validate through data that correlates. All these patterns like frontal midline theta, cortical phase lag, network misfiring, it's all signal, and it's all structural. This means that we can observe where thoughts loop, where they misfire, and where they contradict themselves. And with support, we can help untangle them, restore balance, restore flow. We can realign the phase structure of the mind and soul itself. This is not mind control. It's mind repair. This is not surveillance. It's mentorship. And it's not standardization, but really it's individuation through structural integration, helping each soul, each mind, become more of itself by shedding these inherited distortions and reintegrating those lost subwills. This is the real therapy. I think this is the real future of mental health. So when I see that mental health is infrastructure, I don't mean it as metaphor. I mean that the very structure of our shared reality depends on the clarity of all the minds within it. Mental health isn't a side concern, it's the signal from which society itself is built. Yes, roads and bridges are necessary, but without clear minds, we'll just drive in circles. We'll legislate chaos. We'll keep building castles in the sand. Mental health isn't just about crisis management. It's about signal restoration. It's about remembering that the soul is real, that the mind is mathematically defined, and that internal alignment isn't just possible, it's necessary, and it may even be the whole point of the universe. And also, that every single step towards clarity in a single mind, it creates a new resonance in the entire field. So if we want a better world, we have to start there. Not with more control, with better signal clarity, with minds that know who they are and how to align with other minds. That's infrastructure. And I think that's the foundation of the next world.